Who let you in here, sweetheart? The words cut across the loading dock like a blade. Vivian Cross didn't answer. She stood there in a faded gray windbreaker, a laminated contractor's pass clipped crooked to her collar, a worn leather notebook tucked under her left arm. She looked like nobody. That was the point. Lieutenant Beau Hargrove stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the cologne and the coffee on his breath. He was 29, built like a recruiting poster, and he owned every room he walked into or believed he did. I asked you a question. He reached out and flicked her contractor's badge with one finger, hard enough to spin it on its clip. This says maintenance. So why are you standing in my sector like you belong here? Vivian looked at him. Calm, steady. Not a flinch. I'm exactly where I need to be, she said. Hargrove smiled. It was the kind of smile that comes right before a public execution. Behind him, 3 of his men laughed on cue. And 30 feet away, pressed against a supply crate with a clipboard clutched to her chest, a young private named Simone Cross watched the whole thing and did not yet know that the woman being humiliated in the gray windbreaker was her own mother. Nobody in that hangar knew. Not yet. But in 11 minutes, everyone would. Fort Ellery sat on 900 acres of scrubland in eastern Georgia. 2 runways, 6 hangars, a joint special operations compound that answered to almost no one. On paper, it was a training installation. In practice, it was a kingdom, and every kingdom has a golden boy. At Fort Ellery, the golden boy was Beau Hargrove. 2 deployments. A commendation packet, thick as a phone book. A jaw like it was carved for a statue. He moved through the base the way weather moves through a valley. You didn't argue with it. You just waited for it to pass. Junior enlisted stepped aside when he came down a corridor. Senior chiefs looked the other way when his voice got loud. And the base commander, Colonel Raymond Petty, had long ago decided that a man who produced results was a man you did not correct. Results bought silence. Silence bought Hargrove everything. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that 48 hours earlier, a single sealed memo had landed on Colonel Petty's desk. 3 words at the top, Command Climate Review. No name, no photograph, no arrival time. Just a warning that someone from the office of the Inspector General would be coming, and that when they came, they would be looking. Petty had spent 2 days scrubbing, not the floors, the paperwork. Complaint files vanished into a locked drawer. Incident logs from the last 2 years were under review, which was a polite word for buried. He told his staff to smile, answer briefly, and volunteer nothing. It's routine, Petty said that morning, standing in front of his officers with a coffee cup that trembled slightly in his hand. Show them a clean house, and for God's sake, keep Hargrove busy on the far side of the base. Nobody laughed. They all understood exactly what that instruction meant. Because the thing about a rotten house is that the people living in it stop smelling the rot. They call it normal. They call it the way things are. And they never imagine that one day someone will walk in through the loading dock in a gray windbreaker, take a slow breath, and start writing it all down. Vivian Cross had entered Fort Ellery at 2:14 that afternoon, through the contractor's gate. No escort, no staff car. A rental sedan with civilian plates, which she parked in the visitor lot between a pickup truck and a food service van. Her aide, Major Elena Ruiz, had argued against it the whole drive down. Ma'am, they won't know who you are. Protocol says the command should be notified of your rank on arrival. I know what protocol says. Vivian had checked her reflection in the visor mirror. No makeup, hair pulled back plain, the cheap windbreaker she kept in a garment bag for exactly this purpose. Protocol shows me the house they cleaned for me. I want to see the house they actually live in. So she walked in as a contractor. She showed a standard credential at the gate. The guard glanced at it, glanced at her, and waved her through without a second look. A middle-aged black woman in maintenance gray, invisible by design. And for the first hour, invisible was exactly what she was. She walked the compound slowly, notebook under her arm, and she watched. She watched a supply sergeant scream a private into tears over a misfiled requisition, while 2 officers strolled past without slowing down. She watched a group of enlisted men cluster by rank in the mess line, the newest and the lowest left standing alone at the end. She watched the way the base breathed who got looked at, who got looked through. She wrote 3 things in her notebook. She did not raise her voice once. And then, at 2:58, she turned a corner into Hangar 3, and she saw her daughter. Vivian had not expected to see Simone. That was the truth of it, the part that made her chest go tight under the cheap gray jacket. She had known, abstractly, that Private First Class Simone Cross was stationed at Fort Ellery. She had known it the way a mother knows a fact she can't do anything about. Her daughter had enlisted against her wishes, chosen her own path, asked for space, and Vivian had given it. 3 months of short phone calls. "I'm fine, Mom." "It's fine. Everything's fine." She had not known that fine was a lie, stretched thin over something ugly. Because here was Simone now, 20 years old, standing at a supply station with a clipboard held against her chest, like a shield. And even from across the hangar, Vivian could read the posture. She knew that posture. She'd worn it herself, 30 years ago, as a young enlisted woman, in rooms full of men who'd decided she didn't belong. Shoulders curled in, eyes down. The body of someone who had learned that the safest thing to be was small. Vivian stopped walking. She watched a staff sergeant walk past Simone and, without breaking stride, knock the clipboard out of her hands. Papers scattered across the concrete. The sergeant didn't turn around. 2 other soldiers laughed. Simone crouched, gathered the pages, and said nothing. Nothing. Vivian's jaw tightened. But she did not move, and she did not call out, because 30 years of doing this work had taught her one iron rule. You do not reveal the badge until the badge will do the most good. Rage was a luxury an inspector could not afford. What she felt instead was colder and more precise, the steady recognition that she was looking at a wound, and that the wound had a shape, and that the shape led somewhere. She opened her notebook. She wrote a 4th line. And that was when Beau Hargrove walked into Hangar 3 and saw a maintenance contractor standing in his sector where she had no reason to be. He noticed her the way a hawk notices movement on the ground. Not because she mattered, because she was different. "Who let you in here, sweetheart?" The hangar went quieter. Conversations trailed off. Hargrove's men, 3 of them, drifting in behind him like a small parade, arranged themselves into an audience without being asked. They'd seen this show before. They knew their parts. "This is a secure sector," Hargrove said, louder now, playing to the room. "Contractors don't wander, so either you're lost or you're stupid. Which is it?" "Neither," Vivian said. "I'm working." "Working." He said the word like it was something dirty. He circled her once, slow, taking her in the cheap jacket, the plain shoes, the notebook. "You know what I think? I think somebody in facilities got lazy and hired off the street. I think you walked onto my base, into my hangar, and figured nobody would notice one more mop pusher." He flicked her badge again. It spun on its clip. "Pick a different sector, sweetheart. This one's for people who matter." Vivian looked at him. She did not pick up the challenge. She did not raise her chin. She simply asked, in a voice so level it seemed to unbalance him, "Do you talk to everyone like this?" Hargrove blinked. He wasn't used to questions. He was used to answers. "Only the ones who don't belong," he said. "And lady, you do not belong. Who decides who belongs?" He spread his arms, grinning now, turning to his men. "I do. Look around. You see anyone else in here who looks like you? You see anyone else in a Goodwill jacket holding a little notebook like it's a Bible?" He leaned in. "You wandered in off the street, and now you're going to wander right back out. On your own 2 feet, or with my hand on your collar. Your choice." And across the hangar, Simone Cross went very still. Because she had heard those words before. Different words, different man, same script. She had heard them from the staff sergeant, who called her a quota. She had heard them in the note left outside her barracks door. She had heard them every single day for 3 months, and she had learned to swallow them. And here they were again, aimed now at a stranger, a woman who could have been her aunt, her mother, herself in 30 years. And the stranger did not swallow them. The stranger just stood there, calm as still water, and let the man drown himself in his own noise. Something in Simone's chest, some stubborn, unbreakable thing she'd been sitting on for 3 months, shifted. Let's go back, for a moment. Because to understand why Vivian Cross could stand in that hangar and absorb a man's cruelty without a flicker, you have to understand a kitchen in Baltimore, 35 years ago. Her father, Walter Cross, worked 2 jobs, a janitor by day at a downtown office tower, a night watchman 3 evenings a week. He came home smelling of bleach and cold air, He had hands like tree bark, and a back that was slowly failing him, and he never once, in Vivian's memory, raised his voice. There was a man at the office tower, a junior executive, young and loud, who liked to humiliate the cleaning staff. He'd drop coffee cups on the floor on purpose. He'd call Walter boy, though Walter was twice his age. And one night, when Vivian was 11, she overheard her father describe it to her mother at the kitchen table, and she'd burst into the room with her fists clenched and demanded to know why he didn't say something, why he didn't fight back, why he let that man treat him like nothing. Walter had set down his coffee. He'd looked at his daughter for a long moment. "Baby girl," he said, "a man who has to make you small is telling you something. He's telling you he's afraid he's small himself. You don't have to answer that. You don't have to shrink to fit his fear." He tapped the table once with one thick finger. "Dignity isn't something they give you. It's not a rank. Nobody can take it unless you hand it to them. So don't you ever hand it over. Not to anyone. You hear me?" She'd heard him. Walter Cross died the winter Vivian graduated officer candidate school. He never saw the stars. But she carried that kitchen with her into every room, into every hangar, into every moment when a man who was afraid he was small tried to make her small too. You don't have to shrink to fit his fear. She never did. Back in Hangar 3, Hargrove had run out of patience with a woman who wouldn't perform her own humiliation. "All right," he said. "I'm done being polite." He held up one hand and started counting down on his fingers, loud, theatrical, playing to his men. "You've got 10 seconds to walk out of my hangar before I have you escorted off this base and your little contract torn up." 10, 9, 8. His men joined in. A countdown, like a football stadium. Like this was entertainment. 7, 6, 5. Vivian did not move. She looked past Hargrove, past the grinning men, past the counting, and she found Simone's eyes across the hangar. She held them. 1 second, maybe less, and Simone saw something in the older woman's face that she could not name. Not fear, not humiliation. Something deeper. Something that looked, impossibly, like a promise. 4, 3, 2. Vivian reached up, unclipped the contractor's badge from her collar, and held it in her palm for a moment. Then she dropped it into her notebook and closed the cover. "1," Hargrove said. He dropped his hand. "Time's up, sweetheart. You should have walked." "You're right," Vivian said quietly. "Someone should have walked. Months ago. Out of your career." And she reached into the inside pocket of the cheap gray windbreaker, and she took out a slim black leather case, and she flipped it open with one hand. A badge. Gold. Heavy. The eagle and the shield of the Office of the Inspector General of the United States Army. And beneath it, a laminated federal credential bearing her photograph, her name, and 3 words that stopped Hargrove's heart in his chest. Inspector General Senior. "My name," she said, "is Vivian Cross, Lieutenant General, United States Army, Office of the Inspector General, and you have spent the last 11 minutes on camera." N1. The hangar did not gasp. That was the worst part, for Hargrove. The hangar went silent, the specific silence that comes right before a building collapses, the kind where everyone in the room realizes at the same instant that the floor they've been standing on has been hollow the entire time. Hargrove's mouth opened. No sound came out. His brain was doing arithmetic it could not solve. Contractor. Gray jacket. Notebook. Inspector General. Lieutenant General. 3 stars. The woman he'd called sweetheart. The woman he'd told to pick a different sector. The woman he'd counted down like a stray dog. She outranked every soul on the base. She outranked Colonel Petty by a distance that did not have a name. Vivian did not raise her voice. She did not smile. She lifted the badge slightly, and she spoke 6 words into the radio clipped inside her jacket that no one had known was there. "This is Cross. Secure the installation." At Fort Ellery, a base-wide security hold has a specific sound. It starts with a single tone over the PA. Long, flat, electronic. And then the overhead lights shift. And then, one by one, the heavy magnetic doors on every controlled sector thunk, closed. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Hangar 3's doors sealed. Then the ones down the corridor. Then the ones beyond that, rolling outward across the compound like a wave. Until in the space of 90 seconds, the entire base had gone quiet and locked and still. Nobody in, Nobody out. Bo Hargrove stood in the center of it, in his own hangar, in front of his own men, and understood slowly, and then all at once, that the woman he'd tried to break with words had just, with 6 of her own, frozen an entire military installation around him. He was not a warrior in that room anymore. He was a specimen, and she had been cataloging him under glass the whole time. Major Elena Ruiz appeared at the hangar entrance flanked by 2 military police, a leather briefcase in her hand. She crossed to Vivian and stopped, spine straight. "Installation is secured, ma'am. Colonel Petty has been notified. He's on his way." "Good," Vivian said. She turned to the 2 MPs and nodded once toward Hargrove. "This officer is not under arrest. Not yet. But he is not to leave this base, and every device in this hangar that recorded the last 15 minutes is now evidence. Collect the phones. Preserve everything." Hargrove found his voice at last. It came out cracked. "Ma'am, General, I didn't know who you—" "I know," Vivian said, and for the first time she stepped close to him, close enough that only he could hear. And what she said was not loud, and it was not cruel, and it was somehow worse than either. "You didn't know who I was. That's the whole problem, Lieutenant. You never do. You look at a person and you decide what they're worth in the first half second, and then you build a whole life on being right about it. And nobody has ever made you pay for being wrong." She stepped back. "Today you're going to find out what that costs." Word travels fast on a military base. It travels faster when the word is catastrophic. By the time Colonel Petty half ran into Hangar 3, red-faced and out of breath, the story had already outrun him through every corridor and break room on the compound. The contractor is a 3-star. Hargrove called her sweetheart. Hargrove told her to get out. She locked down the whole base. He's done. They're all done. Petty came to a stop in front of Vivian, and his mouth started producing words before his brain had approved them. "General Cross, ma'am, this is I want you to know that this conduct does not reflect. Fort Ellery has the highest standards of Lieutenant Hargrove. Is an outstanding colonel." Vivian did not raise her voice. She never had to. "In the 90 minutes before you got here, I watched one of your staff sergeants scream a private to tears in your mess hall. I watched another one knock a soldier's paperwork onto the floor and walk away laughing. And I watched a lieutenant you describe as outstanding attempt to physically remove a woman he'd decided was trash from a building in front of a dozen witnesses, none of whom moved. She let that sit. That is not one bad officer, Colonel. That is a climate. And a climate comes from the top." Petty's face went through the stages. Cheeks first, then the forehead, then the lips. "I'll need your complaint files," Vivian went on. "All of them. Not the ones in the drawer you cleaned out for me, the real ones. Incident logs, equal opportunity reports, disciplinary records, 24 months back, unredacted. Major Ruiz will set up in your conference room. We start interviews within the hour, and we start at the bottom, because the people with the least rank always have the most to say and the most to lose by saying it." "Ma'am, you weren't informed I was coming," Vivian said. "I know. That was the point." She turned away from him, and her eyes found Simone again, still standing by the supply station, still clutching her clipboard, staring at the woman with the 3 stars and the gold badge, as if the ground had opened beneath her. Because it had. Because Simone Cross had just watched her mother lock down a United States military base with 6 words, and she had not known, and her mother had not known she was here, and all of it was happening at once. Vivian crossed the hangar. The MPs parted. The colonel stood forgotten. She stopped in front of her daughter, and for one moment the inspector general was gone, and there was only a woman looking at her child. "Simone," she said softly. Simone's chin trembled. "Mom, I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to see me." Her voice broke. "I didn't want you to see me small." Vivian reached out and took the clipboard gently from her daughter's hands, the way you take something heavy from someone who's been carrying it too long. "Baby girl," she said, and something in the way she said it, the exact cadence, came from a kitchen in Baltimore, 35 years gone. "You have never once in your life been small. You just landed somewhere that needed you to believe you were." She set the clipboard down on the crate. "That stops today." The investigation began at 3:40 that afternoon, and it did not stop for 11 hours. Vivian set 3 rules for her team before the first interview. Every conversation recorded, with the subject's knowledge. No soldier interviewed with their commanding officer in the room. And start at the bottom. Always the bottom. They interviewed 22 people over the next 6 hours. Junior enlisted, mid-grade NCOs, a handful of nervous lieutenants. And the pattern emerged, the way a photograph emerges, in a developing trace slowly at first, and then all at once, complete and undeniable. The stories were different. The shape was always the same. A female specialist described being told she'd only made her unit because someone had to fill a slot. She'd filed a complaint. It was acknowledged. Nothing happened. A black corporal described being passed over for a coveted school in favor of a less qualified soldier, and when he asked why, being told to focus on what you can control, he filed a complaint. It was acknowledged. Nothing happened. A young private described a staff sergeant who left a mop propped against her barracks door with a note that read, "Your real assignment." She never filed at all, because the NCO who was supposed to give her the form simply never gave it to her. Each story was a thread. Together they made a rope, and the rope led to the same door every time, the office of Colonel Raymond Petty, where complaints went to die. And then, at 8:15 that night, Major Ruiz knocked on the conference room door. "Ma'am, there's a private first-class cross requesting to speak with the inspection team. She says she has documentation." Ruiz hesitated, because she knew the name. "She says she'll only speak on the record. Same as everyone else." Vivian was quiet for a moment. It would have been easy, so easy to bring her daughter in gently, informally, mother to child. And that was exactly why she couldn't. "Send her in," Vivian said. "On the record. Same as everyone else." Simone came in carrying a manila folder against her chest like a shield, and she sat down across the table from her mother, from the Inspector General, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Take your time, Private," Vivian said. Formal, even, because the recorder was running, and because her daughter deserved to be believed on the strength of what she carried in that folder, not on the accident of who her mother was. Simone took a breath, then another. Then she opened the folder. "I filed 2 complaints in 3 months," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "I kept copies of everything, every form, every response, because..." She stopped. "Because part of me knew the system wouldn't keep them for me." She laid the pages out. The first complaint, the staff sergeant, who called her a quota, filed in her first month. Response, 11 days later. Reviewed. No action required. 4 words. No interview, no follow-up. The second, the mop, the note, your real assignment. Filed 6 weeks ago. Logged into the system. Marked, received, and never updated. 2 follow-up emails, both unanswered. Vivian read each page slowly. She read them the way a person reads a letter from a world they already knew existed but had prayed they were wrong about. And it took everything the Inspector General had, every year of discipline, every hour in that Baltimore kitchen, to keep her face level while she read, in her own daughter's careful handwriting, the record of a cruelty she had not been there to stop. "Private Cross," she said, and her voice held. "When you filed these, did anyone from your command ever contact you afterward?" "No, ma'am." "Did anyone interview the individuals named?" "Not that I know of, ma'am." "Did anyone tell you why the first case was closed after 11 days?" "No, ma'am. I just got the email. No action required. That was it." Vivian set the pages down. She looked at her daughter across the table, and for one heartbeat, just one, the inspector's mask slipped. And what showed through was something enormous and old and aching. "Why did you keep the copies?" she asked. It was not a question in the file. It was a mother's question. Simone looked at her hands. They had stopped trembling. "Because you taught me to," she said. "When I was little, you told me dignity isn't a rank. Nobody can take it unless you hand it over." She looked up. "I've been handing it over for 3 months, Mom. Every day. And I hated myself for it. And then this afternoon I watched a woman in a cheap gray jacket stand in a hangar full of men who wanted her to break, and she just didn't. And I thought, I want to be her when I grow up." Her voice cracked and steadied. And then she turned around, and she was you. The conference room was very quiet. Vivian Cross, Lieutenant General, Inspector General of the United States Army, turned to Major Ruiz and spoke in a voice that had gone slightly rough at the edges. Enter Private Cross's complaint records into the investigation file. Flag both for failure to follow complaint processing procedure. Note that the witness came forward voluntarily and was offered no consideration in exchange. She paused. And note, for the record, that the reviewing officer is recusing herself from any findings specific to this soldier, given the personal relationship, and referring those findings to Major General Foster. Yes, ma'am, Ruiz said quietly. Vivian looked back at her daughter one last time, and this time she let the mother through. Thank you, Private. What you did tonight took more courage than most people in this building will ever understand. Simone stood. She made it to the hallway before the tears came, not the sad kind, but the kind that come when you've been holding something so long, you'd forgotten how heavy it was until the moment you finally set it down. It was Hargrove's turn at 10:20. He came in wearing his service uniform. No swagger now, no audience, no cologne, strong enough to cover the smell of a career on fire. He sat across from the woman he'd tried to humiliate 8 hours earlier, and he could not meet her eyes. Vivian did not mention the hangar. She didn't need to. Lieutenant Hargrove, are you aware of a complaint filed against a member of your unit environment by Private First Class Cross regarding a staff sergeant under your supervision? He swallowed. I heard something. It was handled. It was closed. There's a difference. Were you ever interviewed? No, ma'am. Do you know who closed it? A long silence. Loyalty and survival fought a short, ugly war behind his eyes. Survival won, the way it always did with men like Hargrove. It would have gone through the colonel's office, ma'am. Vivian made a note. Let's talk about this afternoon. In Hangar 3, you approached a woman you believed to be a maintenance contractor. Describe what you did. I asked if she was in the right sector. Is that all you did? Silence. Lieutenant, there are at least 4 recordings of that interaction currently in evidence. I'd encourage accuracy. His jaw worked. His eyes dropped to the table. And then, brick by brick, he laid it out, because there was nothing else left to do. I was out of line. Describe what out of line looked like. I called her sweetheart. I told her she didn't belong. I flicked her badge. I said this sector was for people who matter. I counted down and threatened to have her thrown off the base. Each sentence landed on his chest like a stone. I humiliated her, in front of my men, on purpose. Why on purpose? He didn't answer. You did it on purpose, Vivian said. Because it worked. Because for years, in rooms exactly like that one, humiliating someone smaller than you bought you laughter and loyalty and silence. And no one ever made you pay. So the price kept looking like zero. She closed her notebook. It was never zero, Lieutenant. Someone was always paying. You just never had to watch. She let that sit. I'm not going to end your career over a single afternoon, she said. That's not how this works, and it's not what this is. I'm here because one afternoon revealed a climate that made that afternoon possible, and has been making afternoons like it possible for a very long time. You are a symptom, Lieutenant Hargrove. I came for the disease. She looked at him. But symptoms still carry consequences. You'll learn the extent of them through your chain of command. You're dismissed. Remain on base and available. He stood. He walked to the door. His hand was on the handle when she spoke again. Lieutenant. He turned. The next time you ask someone who let them in the room, Vivian said, consider that the answer might be, they own it. Hargrove left without a word. Colonel Petty's interview began at 11:30 and lasted 41 minutes. It did not go well. Vivian laid Simone's 2 complaint files on the table. She laid the 14 other complaints Ruiz's team had pulled from a physical drawer in his private office, 14 that had been removed from the digital tracking system entirely, so there would be no record, no timeline, no accountability. She laid printed stills from 4 phone recordings of Hangar 3. Petty looked at the table the way a man looks at a shallow grave. Colonel, your command has processed 34 equal opportunity complaints in 24 months. 30 of them were closed, with no action required. 2 were referred upward, both only after external pressure. Can you explain that ratio? End. He tried. He used words like context and operational tempo and lowest appropriate level. He said his people took every complaint seriously. Vivian let him finish. She always let them finish. Then she opened her notebook. At 2:58 this afternoon, I stood in Hangar 3 and watched one of your lieutenants tell a woman he'd decided was worthless to get out of his building. You have described him, to me, personally, as outstanding. 14 complaints against members of this command are sitting in a locked drawer in your office, hidden from the system that exists specifically to track them. She closed the notebook. That is not context, Colonel. That is not operational tempo. That is a commanding officer who decided that the reputation of his base was worth more than the dignity of the people serving on it. And you were wrong. Because the base is those people. There was never anything else to protect. Petty had no words left. There weren't any that would help. This interview is concluded, Vivian said. You'll receive the findings through channels. I'd recommend you begin thinking very carefully about your next conversation with the Judge Advocate General. He stood on legs that didn't quite work, steadied himself on the back of the chair, and walked out like a man leaving a doctor's office after the worst possible news. The door closed, and Vivian Cross sat alone in the conference room for a full minute, looking at the stack of files. 34 complaints, 30 buried, 2 of them written in her own daughter's careful hand, and slid under a stack of training manuals, because a 20-year-old girl had known, somehow, that the system would not keep them for her. She opened her notebook to a clean page. At the top she wrote 2 words, systemic failure. Then she picked up her phone and called Washington. The Fort Ellery report landed on the Secretary of the Army's desk 9 days later. 51 pages, 14 appendices. It was the kind of document that ends things quietly and destroys them loudly. The consequences came in waves. The first wave hit Bo Hargrove. Formal action under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, conduct unbecoming, violation of equal opportunity regulations, failure to maintain the standards of his office. He was not court-martialed. The report was explicit that a single officer's cruelty was the product of a command that rewarded it, and that punishing the man while ignoring the machine would be a lie. But the machine's failure did not spare the man. His pending commendation was withdrawn. He was suspended from his unit and reassigned to an administrative post at a supply depot, 2 states away. No glory, no deployments, no audience. He would spend 18 months behind a desk, processing paperwork for the same junior enlisted he had once looked straight through. His father, a retired officer who had raised his son to believe that the loudest man in the room was the most powerful, called him the night the orders came down. For the first time in Bo Hargrove's life, the old man had nothing to say. The second wave hit Colonel Petty. Relieved of command, loss of confidence in his ability to command, 7 words that mean 1. The finding that buried him was not the dismissal ratio. It was the drawer. 14 complaints, pulled from the system, hidden from oversight. Evidence not of neglect but of intent. He submitted his retirement papers within 72 hours. No ceremony. No folded flag. He drove off the base on a gray morning in a rental car, and the gate guard waved him through without a word. The third wave was quieter and far larger. Acting on the report's recommendations, the Inspector General's office ordered a full restructuring of Fort Ellery's command climate infrastructure. An independent, equal opportunity office, reporting not to the base commander, but directly to the Regional Inspector General. Mandatory complaint timelines acknowledged in 48 hours. Investigation opened in 14 days. Resolution in 60. A central database, visible to oversight authorities, so that no complaint could ever again disappear into a drawer. A climate survey every 6 months, its results reaching Washington before they reached the base commander, so no one at the top could ever again control the story before anyone else got to read it. The culture would not change overnight. Culture never does. But the architecture changed. The walls that had protected the cruelty came down, and windows went up in their place. There was one more thing in the report that regulation did not require. At the bottom of the appendix concerning the reopened complaints, the ones Major General Foster had substantiated after Vivian recused herself, there was a handwritten line. It was not typed. It was added in ink, in a careful hand, and it was addressed to a private first class who would receive her own copy weeks later. Private Cross, you kept the copies when the system would not. You told the truth on the record when it would have been easier and safer to stay small. The courage you showed is not a footnote to this report. It is the reason this report exists. Simone read it 3 times. Then she folded it, put it in the manila folder with her complaint copies, and set the folder on top of her desk, not underneath the training manuals this time. On top, where she could see it. 6 months after the lockdown, Lieutenant General Vivian Cross came back to Fort Ellery. She didn't come in a gray windbreaker this time. She came in full dress uniform, 3 stars on each shoulder, the leather notebook the same one tucked under her arm. The gate guard recognized her before she showed her ID and saluted so fast he nearly dropped his clipboard. The base looked the same from the outside. Same runways, same hangars, same flat Georgia scrub stretching to the horizon. But the air inside was different. Not perfect, not healed, different. The new commanding officer, Colonel Denise Whitaker, a 26-year veteran handpicked by the regional command, met her at the entrance and did not sugarcoat a thing. Better, ma'am. Not fixed. Better. The independent EO office has processed 51 complaints in 6 months. Everyone investigated. Everyone answered. Some folks still don't trust it. Can't say I blame them. Trust takes time, Vivian said. Accountability takes longer. They walked the compound together, and Vivian noticed the small things. A young private, walking down a corridor without pressing herself against the wall. A mixed group of officers and enlisted sharing a table in the mess, not sorted by rank the way they'd been 6 months before. A bulletin board by the main office with the Equal Opportunity Hotline printed in letters you could read from across the room. Small things. But culture is made of small things. They passed Hangar 3. The same doors. The same concrete. Vivian paused in the entrance and looked at the spot where she'd stood in a cheap gray jacket, while a man counted down from 10. "You all right, ma'am?" Major Ruiz asked, at her shoulder. "I'm fine," Vivian said. "I was just thinking. He asked me who let me in." She almost smiled. The truth is, my badge isn't what mattered that day. What mattered was that a 20-year-old private had been keeping copies of complaints in a folder under her training manuals for 3 months, waiting, hoping someone would come along who was worth handing them to. She looked at Ruiz. "I didn't change this place. She did. I just opened the door." There was, at the end, a building. Vivian Cross used the weight of the Fort Ellery report and a good deal of her own influence to stand up a program across the service's junior enlisted pipeline. A confidential advocacy office, staffed by people trained to catch the complaints that used to disappear, to walk a scared 19-year-old through a process designed to protect them instead of exhaust them, to make sure that the next Simone Cross, in the next Hangar 3, would not have to keep her own copies under a stack of manuals, because she knew the system wouldn't. They asked her what to call it. She thought of a kitchen in Baltimore, a janitor with hands like tree bark, who came home smelling of bleach and cold air, who had never once raised his voice, and who had told his 11-year-old daughter that dignity was not a rank, and no one could take it unless she handed it over. "The Walter Cross Initiative," she said. On the morning Vivian drove off Fort Ellery for the last time, Private First Class Simone Cross was packing a bag. She'd been selected on her own merit by Colonel Whitaker personally for a leadership development course. She was going to learn how to lead the kind of soldiers she had been 6 months ago, the kind who pressed themselves against the walls, the kind who learned to be small. She was going to teach them not to. She zipped the bag, looked around the small barracks room one last time, and picked up the manila folder from the top of her desk. She didn't need it anymore. The system had her copies now, in a database no one could quietly empty. But she packed it anyway. Some things you keep not because you have to, but because they remind you of the day you stopped leaving and started standing. So let me ask you, if you'd been standing in that hangar watching a man tear a stranger apart with words while everyone around him laughed, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have looked down at your clipboard, curled your shoulders in, and learned, one more time, how to be small? Because here's the thing the loud man never understands. The loudest voice in the room is almost never the most powerful one. Real authority doesn't announce itself. It walks in through the loading dock, in a cheap gray jacket. It watches. It learns. It writes it all down. And then, when the moment is right, it opens the door. Respect everyone. You truly never know who's standing in front of you. If you believe dignity isn't given by rank but earned by character, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Because somewhere, right now, there's a 20-year-old keeping copies in a folder, waiting, hoping someone worth telling will finally walk through the door. Be that someone.